Bonjour à tout le monde. Merci énormément d'être venu en si grand nombre. Thank you for being there here in such numbers today. Welcome to this event. We're so honored to have Professor Amitav Acharya with us today. This event is presented by the Center of International Policy Studies, CIPS, and the Asian Studies Network at the Faculty of Social Sciences here at the university. And we're very, very happy to welcome Professor Acharya to give a book talk today, present his new book, The Once and Future World Order, While Global Civilization Will Survive the Decline of the West. There are actually books at the entrance of the room. So Professor Acharya will be happy to sign a book for you if you want to purchase the book at the end of the seminar afterwards. So Professor Acharya is a distinguished professor and UNESCO chair in transnational challenges and governance at the School of International Service, American University in Washington, D.C. He was a professor not too far from here at York University in Toronto and the University of Bristol as well. Held fellowships at Harvard and Oxford universities and published numerous articles, in academic and major newspapers. You may know some of his most famous works, including The End of American World Order, which he published in 2014, well before this became a sort of accepted turn of phrase, and Whose Ideas Matter, from Cornell University in 2009. There is a thread line that runs through Professor Acharya's work. Actually, I was trying to go back to some of your earliest work, and I was trying to get to the bottom of his publication list, and I had to click 8 times on show 100 more. When I got to the bottom, I even saw a piece towards the very beginning of the list that had a publication date of 1926. Yes.
Not sure it's a good news.
So now we know the secret to Professor Acharya's prolific contribution, that he can travel in time. So in all seriousness, Professor Acharya has been working for decades on the notions of non-Western powers agency ideas, practices, often in Asia, but in this book, much more broadly than Asia. In the context of this rebalancing of what he calls and then problematizes in the book, The Rise of the Rest. The book is so timely, right? It offers the ultimate decentering perspective, decentering the West's very own perception of its importance, decentering the trajectory of ideas behind world order that have been in some ways appropriated, in some ways supplemented, in some ways developed by the West, but that benefit from much older, much more diverse roots reaching across time. One example that I found quite interesting is his discussion of the legacy of the Chinese idea, the notion of Wu Wei, or non-resistance, and how it captured Quenet's, the French economist, imagination or attention, and sort of became the notion of laissez-faire. And so Professor Acharya takes us in this way through the sort of genealogy of ideas at the core of Western notions of global order. The central examples, such as international development or human rights or human security, all have much more diverse, non-Western roots than we assume. And at the time when Western leaders still like to talk in terms of like-mindedness, values-based foreign policy, the rules-based international order, I think that Professor Acharya's work is enjoining us to be more humble, to look beyond traditional boundaries, to reach for knowledge. More importantly, for policymakers today and students here today, I'm happy to see you in great numbers, to be more hopeful. This is something very unique to Professor Acharya's book, is that it is a hopeful book. Thank you for that. And before we get started, I hope you will allow me on behalf of CIPS and the university to give voice to the Indigenous affirmation. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous peoples in this region from all nations across Canada who call our national capital home. And we acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Acharya. I have about 40 minutes, and then we will take questions.
Very much, Pascal, for that wonderful, kind introduction. I hope you can hear my voice. There's no microphone here. And I say the same thing when you ask questions, shout, okay? It's a big room, I didn't realize. And I have the doctors told me that I have a suboptimal hearing ever since I was a child. And I thought that was the biggest blessing I had. I mean, a lot of junk I didn't hear in my life. Please try to speak a little louder with microphones. But thank you very much. And I'm really glad to be back in Ottawa. I can't say I have been to University of Ottawa before. Most of the time I came to Ottawa, probably 90% of the time was to do policy work. The bottom is here, I go to Lester Pearson building, the beautiful building, and the Canal Department of National Defense. And we used to have this D&D grants, like 10, 15 universities across Canada had this security studies grants, and we used to come here in connection with conferences. My memory of Ottawa has always been policy, the world of policy, not academia. But there are fantastic academics here, and very glad to be launching my book in Ottawa at the University of Ottawa. So since time is short, let me just go straight to the book. And this is the book cover, and these are the chapters, 15 chapters. Come back to this, because I want to tell you why this book is different from other books about world order. So looking at the table of contents. As you can see, it covers most parts of the world. Maybe the South Pacific is not here, although in the book it does have a section on the South Pacific. But all regions, all major civilizations. So if it's not clear, 5,000 years of history from Sumerians, Egyptians to the Americans, so to speak. And the global south, and ends up with some projections of the future. One important thing to keep in mind that this is not a book about contemporary current affairs. So I think 90% of the book is historical and deeply historical. So only chapter 13, to some extent, the rise of the rest, or return of the rest, talks about the global south, but from the post-World War II period, from the Bandung Conference in 1955. So it's a little more contemporary, but not that contemporary. And the last chapter reflects on what's going on in the world, the decline of or end of the liberal, US-led liberal international order, and my idea of the multiplex incoming world order, they call the multiplex world. But most of this is the rest of the book in history. And there's very little directly theory, even though I am a scholar of international relations and I do IR theory, but I try to broaden it. IR theory can frighten people, put up people, all these ideas of isms, constructivism, liberalism, and realism. So I wanted to write this book in a way that people could relate to it. No knowledge or interest in theory is required. That's another thing about this book. It doesn't make any predictions about the future. The idea is that if you know enough about history, you can know enough, you will have a sense of the possibilities of future. So the history doesn't repeat itself, in my view, but at least it opens up possibilities. If a current world order ends, what are the choices? What are the possibilities? What are the combinations? Where might this come from? So if you look at deep history, you find that, okay, there are many possibilities. So maybe the Westphalian state is not the only form of a political system through history. In fact, it's a very short life and relatively short, 5,000 species. The rise, dominance of the West is a blip in the long march of history. So there will be actually nothing surprising that China is rising or India is rising, because two countries used to have over 30% of the world's GDP, sometimes 40%, just from the 18th century. So I'm not saying that China is going to dominate, take over the world, but then there are possibilities. There are worlds in which things used to be different. Power was managed differently. Multipolarity, which sometimes scares people because it was very unstable before World War II, led to World War I and World War II. They meet on multipolarity, but multipolarity in the historical sense has also been very stabilizing. In the Amarna system, 15th century BC. So history allows you to have a very broad canvas, broad range of possibilities, so that you don't really become a presentist, like live in the present and think whatever is happening now is what always happened. So Western dominance was never true of most of history. The idea of West did not exist. The idea of the rest did not exist. In fact, civilizations often interacted and learned from each other peacefully. Not always, but peacefully. There are many examples of peaceful interaction among civilizations and mutual learning. So this is why the book is deeply historical, but not predicting the future, but giving you a sense of what are the drivers, what are the possibilities that we can keep in mind. And this, from there, both academics and policymakers can, use that as the basis for driving their own. So I have my own sense of the future, but it's not something like I'm into futurology. So moving on then, there are four arguments or key arguments, but I think the first one is really the most important one. So, world order, creation and management, or maintenance of world order, which I very broadly define. This is a very contested term. You can spend hours and days and years, and books have been written on what is world order. But I go for the very basic definition, and the ensuring stability, not peace, but stability, and dispelling chaos. Chaos is a term that has been used throughout history to kind of a dualism in the historical framing of world order, right from the Egyptians. Egyptians used to have this two terms called Maat and Isfet. So chaos versus order. Order is Maat and chaos is Isfet. And the struggle between chaos and order is what let the world go around. And that sort of distinction has been reproduced or found in many other civilizations. The Persians, the Indians, the Chinese, the Aztecs in Mexico, and you can find them also in European civilization and in the United States. I know how often you hear American presidents say, we are the force for stability and we are going to defeat chaos and instability, the forces of disruption. Recently in Iran and North Korea and the like. So world order basically is creating stability and dispelling chaos as policymakers define it, or leaders define it, or even people define it. But It is also not a very global thing. Actually, there is no such thing as a global world order. Only Britain and the United States came close to creating a global hegemony. Yeah, but even that was complete, and that was not complete. The British never really controlled Europe because of the balance of power system. I'm talking about continental Europe. And the United States basically did not really control Russia, the Soviet Union, or China, or a lot of countries in the global south that are not really following the American policy directives. They are non-aligned. Even the US was the supreme power and the global superpower, and more so than any other power since World War II, but it really did not have a global order in which it can dominate everybody, or its norms and ideas actually affected everybody. There are a lot of resistance to the United States then and now. And most world orders are regional. So the Roman Empire, the Chinese, say, Han or the Tang or the Qing, the Indian, Persian, they're all regional. And but still, we call them world order. So world order is not the same as a global order, and that's a kind of a idea that I think Henry Kissinger said exactly the same thing. There's no such thing as a global world order, and I agree with that. Probably the only thing I agree with him, and that we can talk about a Chinese world order, we can talk about an Islamic world order, a Mongol world order, we can talk about Indian world order, as long as the makers of that order believe that their ideas, their institutions, their ways and modes of governing the region that dominate is universal. And it is true and universally applicable. So they create the world unto themselves. Now, so what is the big argument here then? That world order, the creation of world order is not a monopoly of any civilization, whether the West or the East or the rest, China, India, Islam. It is a shared creation. Now, shared creation, what does it mean? It means basically that the core ideas and mechanisms, in a very fundamental, foundational sense, whether it's the independence of states. I mean, you can call it sovereignty, but the whole idea is that states should be independent and not be gobbled up by an empire. So, diplomacy, peace treaties, free trade, the trade should be open. Free trade is a modern contemporary term, but the idea that trade should be open and based on rules that you can trade if you pay customs duties. So humanitarian values like just war principles and much more. And that means human rights as well, and Republican government. There's a lot more. Are the roots in multiple civilizations, multiple places through history. But this is the most subversive argument of this book, that world order is not a monopoly, but a shared creation. And even though we may have terms for it, I mean, all this like human rights today, or democracy, or republicanism, or free trade, they are contemporary terms. But what are the foundational ideas behind them? The basic idea, even if they're imperfect, early versions, they can be found, and they were created in many different locations. Sometimes they were created independently. So civilizations that are far apart from each other, like the Inca civilization and say the Persian civilization, away in time and space, no known contact, but actually ended up creating very similar types of world order in many ways. So the idea of what the Chinese call peaceful coexistence, a bunch of states or proto-states can live together peacefully without always fighting. They'll fight, but they'll find a way to coexist. Not a Chinese idea. I mean, it happened in this Iroquois right here in the U.S. Canada, what is today U.S. and Canada border region, New York, Ontario, and Quebec, and the idea of such confederacy also existed in other parts of the world, and in fact, the United States founders, some of them at least, were inspired by it. What they saw among the native Indian arrangement, the Iroquois Confederacy. So the point is that sometimes similar ideas, if not the same institutions or ideas, can be created independently by civilizations. Because human beings, when faced with the same problem or similar problem, often come up with similar solutions. So the solutions to problem of anarchy, whether it's a problem of oppression, problem of warfare, problem of, ecological degradation. There are, of course, variations, but there are also a lot of similarities because it's a problem-solving aspect of human nature. But there are also sometimes diffusion. Civilizations learn from each other, and there's a long history of civilizations, of states learning, societies learning from each other, going back to very, very early period of our history. And we have a lot of examples of this. Of course, now the dominant discourse tells you that the West has provided most of the key ideas. The rest is basically emulating the idea of the Westphalian sovereignty, nationalism, democracy. But the West has also got a lot of ideas from the rest, both scientific ideas, but also philosophical ideas, rational understanding of human behavior or the creation and maintenance of the universe, like global, not the global, but stability and peace, approaches to stability and peace. Those things have also been diffused from the rest to the West. And I will give you some examples. The rise of the West and the dominant sort of force in world politics, which has been around for the last 200-300 years, would not have been possible without it learning from the rest in many ways. And this is not just science and technology, like gunpowder, compass, people always talk about those navigation, but I'm talking about philosophy, like I'm talking about ideas about creating and maintaining government and maintaining peace. And that's something the book deeply explores, going beyond all this normal thing about scientific and technological diffusion from other civilizations to the West. Okay, so that's the key point. The rest is basically is important, but I don't have time to go into all this. But I want to say the rise of the West depended on Europe's borrowing of ideas and innovations, and not just extracting resources. While they were extracting resources, exploiting, they are also borrowing ideas. And non-Western, and this is coming to the modern period, contemporary period, not even modern, like 1945. And so this book is historical, but it doesn't mean it neglects what's happened. The same process of borrowing and agency of non-Western civilizations can be found after 1945. The non-Western, the post-colonial states and societies or leaders, or I won't call them civilizations, let's say post-colonial states. They were not, speak of global South today, they're not passive, but if you see these were active contributors to post-World War II order in areas of self-determination, human rights, racial equality, and multilateralism. In fact, they filled a lot of gaps that existed after the San Francisco conference. We're having the 80th anniversary this week. In some ways, the UNGA is meeting, the UN Charter did not really create many. Now, there was no racial equality norm, for example. Anti-racialism, anti-colonialism barely mentioned. In fact, I can show you a chart how little of that was in San Francisco when the UN Charter was drafted. So a lot of these additional gaps are filled by post-colonial countries, especially at conferences like the Bandung Conference, but later through their work at the United Nations. And finally, the decline of Western dominance doesn't mean the end of world order. That's the West is declining, the whole world order is collapsing. That I disagree with. So this is actually an opportunity to build a more inclusive world, not necessarily a more peaceful world, although it can happen, but no world order has been entirely peaceful. The last world order, liberal international order, was very stable for the West, but very, very conflictual, violent for the rest. Almost 98% of the conflicts actually happened in the global South. Europe was spared, the United States was spared, Canada was spared. Now, of course, we see conflict in Europe, but still, when you say the liberal order was really great, peace and stability, the long peace, as John Gaddis has called it, it was not peaceful at all for Africa, for East Asia, for South Asia, for Middle East, and the like. So no world order is actually peaceful per se, but it can be inclusive. And inclusive means where we have more cooperation or at least a level playing field, not cooperation. And that can lead to new possibilities of peace and stability, but not necessarily. And I emphasize stability rather than peace here, but I think it's important to keep that in mind, that if I sound a bit optimistic, it's not because I think a peaceful world is coming after the decline of the West. That can happen. But I think this is a world in which more actors, more countries, more societies, and more civilizations can participate and have agency. And we'll take it from there and see where it goes. It can be. Finally, well, as I said, different powers, regions, and civilizations. So now, Michael, good to see you. I want to talk about some examples. And this is this is kind of the book is set as a series of stories, right? This is a trade book. This is not the kind of book Mike Williams writes. I used to write like that. I still write, but it's like a series of stories. It's published by Basic Books, Hatchet Book, the second largest publisher in the world. So more like the Penguin book style. I had to spend 2 years rewriting what I had written because I want to make sure it's easily readable, not by people like me or the academic community like us here, but also by policymakers, the media, and the person who has no knowledge of political science and international affairs. Okay. Okay, so diplomacy. So the invention of diplomacy in 1259 by a treaty between King Ramses II, people call it, Egypt, and the Hittites, the emperor of king, some become emperor of the Hittites. So the Egyptian Hittite treaty of Treaty of Kadesh, because it's signed in a place called Kadesh in Anatolia and today's Turkey, and it set out a big superpowers of that period. You can call them the bipolar world of that period. And they fought, and they never really conquered each other. And they signed a treaty, each coined victory after the Battle of Kadesh in 75, they signed a treaty. And the principles of the treaty are very similar. In fact, they anticipated what we have the UN, United Nations. The non-aggression. I mean, I don't have to explain everything one take. Egypt should not attack Hatti, territory from Hatti. Hatti should not attack Egypt. Was the map that shows you where they're located. Similarly, I look at the UN Charter, non-use of force and non-aggression. Moving on, you can also see even more interesting, extradition and alliance. So if Egypt is attacked, Hatti will help. If Hatti is attacked, Egypt will come to help. And these are translated from uniform tablets, but also there are two versions of it that are identical. So this is one of the probably few documents, rare documents, where the Egyptian version and the versions of the two antagonists are identical. And you'll find that one in Egypt in the Temple of Ramses, and the other one in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, the version that the Hittites had. And so if you are challenging, you're a rebel, you're a terrorist, or you challenge a rebellious prince against the ruler of Egypt, you flee to Hatti to seek sanctuary. What will Hatti do? Capture you and give you back to the king of Egypt. No shelter. It's extradition. That's also non-intervention in many ways. You cannot interfere by giving shelter to each other's enemies. So you also have, again, the alliance, the modern principle of alliance, collective defense, and collective security. If one is attacked, you come to help, but subject to the consent. And there is actually a thing here, I didn't put it up, that if Egypt wants to help Hati must agree that Egypt should help. So it's pretty specific, pretty sophisticated, and there's a whole lot of other principles like that. So in many ways, that is kind of the first peace treaty, because it happened after a war that was kind of a standoff. And it was written down, the texts are beyond doubt authentic, because they're also identical in both sides. How about freedom of the seas? We go to one of the biggest principles behind globalization and free trade. And we give credit to Hugo Grotius. I mean, a liberal, the founder of, thinker of liberalism, but also wrote this text called Mare Liberum. Quite a long history short. Hugo Grotius was basically on the payroll of the Dutch East India Company. His cousin was the captain of a warship that sank a Portuguese galleon off Singapore in 1603. The Portuguese were harassing the Dutch because they were the first in the Indian Ocean, and they didn't want anybody else to come in. So they demanded protection money, or you cannot trade. The Dutch got upset, they sank the ship. Now, captain of the ship, and they took all the loot of the ship, took it to Amsterdam, the Admiralty, and they sold it over Europe. So the case was, a complaint was filed in the Admiralty against the Dutch, but they hired Hugo Grotius, young lawyer called Hugo Grotius. He was not a barrister to plead the case, he was a legal scholar, and he said, okay, sea is common to everybody. Now, there's a lot of debate about this, but believe me, the idea that sea is open is not a European Roman idea. The Roman Emperor, Byzantine Emperor Justinian had this idea that sea is free, but Mediterranean was never an open sea. So you talk about the Roman Empire creating free trade. Well, more trade, but the right of free trade was only available to Roman citizens, not to non-Roman citizens. And secondly, the Romans called Mediterranean Mare Nostrum, our sea. The Indian Ocean was nobody's sea. Indian Ocean was managed by no empires, but small states. Malindi, Malacca, Mogadishu, Hormuz, Aden, Calicut, going all the way to Malacca. India and China were not empires of the sea, they were empires of land. Sea was open. That's why same Dutch who hired Hugo Grotius to justify the looting of the Portuguese ship, and Grotius said it's open to everybody, got the ideas from what was already in the Indian Ocean. He might have got some ideas from European legal scholars as well, but certainly he had access, was given documents of the Indian Ocean by the Dutch East India Company. So same Dutch went on to establish a much bigger monopoly than the Portuguese. And they did that over Indonesia, but we had the Spice Islands. They started harassing the Indonesian, those days, of course, there's no such thing as Indonesia. So the sultanates of, say, Makassar or the Maluku, the Spice Islands, so we cannot trade with each other. Before, they could trade with each other. They could trade with India. They could trade with China. Now, the Dutch said, you have to trade to us. We'll buy it from you, we'll sell, we'll give you a percentage. And the Sultan of Makassar, when he refused, they just burnt down his capital and called it Fort Rotterdam. Now, the Sultan of Makassar said to the Dutch that God made the land and the sea. The land he divided among men, and the sea gave him. It has never been heard that anyone should be forbidden to sell the seas. No protection, no, we don't need, it's open. So anybody can trade as long as you pay customs duty. So that it's actually not only rules-based, it's documented. There is a text that still available, written in the 15th century by a bunch of sea captains of Malacca. Malacca was the biggest trading port in that area at that time. And it's called Maritime Laws of Malaysia. Undang-Undang Malacca. Sorry, Maritime Laws of Malacca. There's also a Maritime Law of Malaysia. Of that period, there was no Malaysia in the modern sense of the term. So it was Malacca, basically. It lays out the duties and responsibilities of the captain, the sailors, laws of compensation, laws of arbitration. It's rules-based. And it made Malacca the most prosperous city, port city state in that period, of that period. So much so that Tome Pires, who was the Portuguese traveler to Malacca to the just after the conquest, said, whoever is Lord in Malacca has his hand to the throne of Venice, because that's why you control the flight trade. That's the reason why the Portuguese decided to capture Malacca, because that will make them much richer than the British and the French. And for a time it did. So the Indian Ocean trade, the largest oceanic trade in the world, this was before the European so-called discovery of the Americas or the Trans-Pacific trade. This was the largest oceanic trade in the world. And it was not run by any empire. It was open, free to anybody, and rules-based. Now, this tells you that you don't really need a hegemon to have open trade. So this is something I've written in an article in Foreign Policy a couple of weeks ago, that this whole idea of hegemonic stability, you need a American to maintain free trade, is a myth. There has been cases of long distance trade, well maintained, well managed. There are of course problems, but generally trade booming and prosperous doesn't require. You can do it through small state. Doesn't require the hegemon on empire. The European empires extended their jurisdiction to the sea. The Asian empires did not do it. The emperor's raids stopped on land. When the Sultan of Maldives asked the Mughal emperor to protect them from the Portuguese, the official of the Mughal emperor said in India that we cannot get in the sea. It is not our jurisdiction. Okay, humanitarian values. So look at the language of the Geneva Conventions and language of the Code of Manu. The Code of Manu is a legal code. It is very controversial. There are other parts of the code that are not so nice, but it's also not attributed to one person. There's no evidence that there was such a thing called Manu. In India, there is a tradition of creating people, creating gurus, creating scholars, holy people, and ascribe text to them. And there's no, like Kautilya, we don't know there was a Kautilya who wrote Arthashastra. I don't think we know there is a Homer in real life. So this person also had this code, and look at the rules about protecting civilians and not harming soldiers who have surrendered, who are fleeing from the battle with weapons are broken. There are also rules about not using poisonous weapons. And many of these are actually reproduced or similar to what we have in Geneva Conventions. We don't know about this. And this was actually observed, not because India was a peaceful country. It's certainly the opposite. These rules are created because there are too much violence. And they wanted to reduce civilian casualty, collateral damage, and some sort of a regulation. So it's not because of the peacefulness of Indian. No civilization is entirely peaceful or entirely violent. So origins of human rights, the King Ashoka's edict, while we talk about human rights, protecting people from unjust imprisonment, harsh treatment. Now, this is of course something that the King Ashoka provided. But the Magna Carta, which we think is the foundational document of human rights, was also in some ways proclamation by the king. But it was done under duress. In this case, it was done voluntarily. It had actually more legitimacy. The Magna Carta was declared null and void by the Pope immediately after, because the Pope had unjustly posted the king and King John. And King John died a year later. It was brought back. But it did not benefit the peasants. It only benefited the freemen. It actually led to more exploitation of the peasants because now they had property rights. So this actually did not do that. There was a document in West Africa, the Mandan Charter, which was proclaimed by Sundiata Keita, the leader of the Malinke tribe, now who founded the contemporary Mali, talked about property rights. The 5 ways to acquire property: buying, donation, exchange, work, and inheriting. Any other form without convincing testimony that has been arbitrarily decided is not right, it's doubtful. Well, Magna Carta said something very similar. Property or inheritance rights, no confiscation illegally of property. So property right did exist in West Africa, but we don't know about the and Fuga, the Mandan Charter. And again, the difference is that Mandan Charter benefited everybody and actually lasted. And about the same time, early 13th century, the two documents were created. And Magna Carta is considered while the Universal Declaration on Human Rights is considered the new Magna Carta of our time, as Franklin Roosevelt's wife Eleanor Roosevelt said. She was chairing the Human Rights UDHR drafting committee, but nobody has heard about West African Mandan Charter. China's most consequential contribution to the world order. Gunpowder, paper making, I can take up, so there. But I don't think none of that above is true. China's most important contribution was this, trying to create a merit-based civil service based on open competitive examination, which is a big foundation of contemporary world order. So the British were so exasperated about their civil service, how it was being recruited. Most of them are children of the nobility and getting jobs just because of who the parents are. And most of them are incapable. So the British Treasury Secretary of that time said, the British system of recruiting produced civil servants that really could not either read or write, almost an idiot. So they actually, where did they get the idea of changing the civil service, of public service? They got it from China. So the Chinese had this public examination system, and to cut a long story short, the British East India Company got this idea from Canton, so they had an office, but the European Jesuits got it from China and took it to France. The French adopted it first, they didn't succeed. The British then got it through the East India Company, they succeeded in reforming the civil service. The Americans got it from the British. They didn't trust the Chinese. The Chinese, well, they did say that China is the most enlightened and enduring government of the Eastern world, but we could not, no intention of commending the religion or imperialism of China. But the British have got it from the Chinese. Why can't we? Because we got so much that. We got democracy, our institutions. So if the British can get it from the Chinese, why shouldn't we? So in a very convoluted way, this language is, but it's all available, by the way. So the United States was also influenced by it. Okay, rational mode of inquiry. What God did before he created the universe. Did God create the universe out of nothing and a single act of creation, the creationism? Well, that was challenged in every civilization, in India, in Islam, and in Christianity. But when the crucial turning point was just before the Renaissance, the European philosophers in Bologna, Oxford, and Paris, the first universities, Thomas Aquinas being the dean of the theology of the University of Paris, struggling against the church, challenging creationism. Where did they get the idea from? They got the idea not directly from Aristotle, although they did talk about it, that some of the knowledge had disappeared. The Arabs have translated and preserved and interpreted and enhanced. A guy called Ibn Rushd, Moroccan jurist, magistrate, he was asking questions like, what did God do before he created the universe? So this is philosophy. Philosophy asks the questions, not accepts something like that, just like the Greeks did. The Arabs were influenced by the Greeks, but they also had a lot of their own original idea. But the first test of Greek philosophy in Europe came not directly through the Greek text. They were burned down, destroyed, hidden somewhere. There were some of them were found later. They came from Arabic translations because that's what the Arabs did. And this is basically very influential for the period of Renaissance. So the Muslim Arabs translated a lot of text in Greek, Hindu Arabic numeral system, of course, astronomical text, numerical text. Metaphysics of Aristotle initially went to Europe through Arabic translation. There was no Greek translation at that time available. So Islam preserves classical knowledge, bridging civilization from classical to the modern, the West to the East, East to the West, and never gets much credit for that. The Maya, Inca, Aztec, and Iroquois, now I'm running out of time, I'll be very quick. You will find out. But the Mayas created the city-state system very similar to the Sumerians and the Greeks. The Incas created a decentralized empire, a lot of autonomy for the Suyus, the regions, almost like a federal empire, similar to Persia and Guptas and the British. British also gave a lot of autonomy, so supposedly to certain rulers and directly colonizing them. The Aztecs ran a tributary system. Now they are vilified for human sacrifices and all that. There are actually more people dying of England of execution than by the Aztec Empire at that time. They had a very high literacy rate. And the Iroquois, which right here, if the Iroquois did not support, that they did not support the Americans. They sided with the French. Canada will be ruling the United States. So they were among the first to recognize the United States of America. And Benjamin Franklin exhorted his fellow so-called founding fathers that if 6 nations of ignorant savages could be capable of forming a scheme for such an union and be able to execute it in such a manner that it has subsisted ages, 500 years, could have gone back even further, and appears indissoluble. That kind of a union should be impractical for a dozen English colonies. Now, there is controversy about all this, but the fact is that whether American founders got the Iroquois as a model or not, a lot to learn from them, but such a model existed, such a union existed. Whether you learn it from that or not, Benjamin Franklin certainly admired them. But the fact that they were capable of creating such a confederation. So I want to conclude now. The past matter. Okay. Now, this happened in 3000 BC, 1500 BC. So modern world is so different, right? Here you go. So Robert Darwin said, Robert Darwin said, theories of democracy. To deny that Athens was a democracy would be rather like saying that what the Wright brothers invented was not an airplane, doesn't look quite like the Singapore Airlines. It was still an airplane. And I have no problem. I give credit to the Wright brothers. But the Greeks invented democracy too. But that democracy not only was very limited, only male with military service in Athens can have the right to vote. And it didn't have individual liberty, something that actually stunned me when I first came across this idea, that actually the liberty of the polis, the Greek city-states, the liberty of the polis, not liberty of the individual. Individuals have limited rights of challenging the state. If you did that too much, you'll be like Socrates, forced to drink poison, commit suicide, or ostracized. Greeks ostracized everybody, including the victors of Themistocles, legendary battles of Marathon and Salamis. They didn't like anybody who challenged the state. So they think of democracy without civil liberties. Now, but I still have no problem giving Athens credit for democracy. With the same logic, without having the same kind of epistemic double standards, we should also think the Indians, the Chinese, the Muslims in the early, imperfect, foundational form got ideas about world order that actually persisted and became more and more developed. And so only in the 19th and 20th century, we have the contemporary ideas of human rights and democracy. Before that, it was all foundational, all basic. Some ideas from the non-Western world actually were more perfect. I think the ideas of just war in India were more perfect than what we have today, and they were actually used and obeyed and observed. But a lot of things were distorted by European colonization. So this is leading to my last point, San Francisco Conference. You see colonialism and San Zero Times. This is 22 volumes of San Francisco Conference. Winston Churchill said Britain will walk out of San Francisco Conference if we discuss colonialism, because Britain had all the colonies at that time. And racialism, very, very limited, only in the context of racial equality was not there. Racism was not mentioned, right? Ian Smarts was a big player, the South African architect of apartheid. He actually was a big player, both in the League of Nations and the United Nations. So where did that come from? As I was saying earlier, a lot of them were, the gaps are filled by global South countries. So the UDHR draft by the French said all men are created equal. Indian delegate, Hansa Mehta, woman delegate from India, said all human beings are created equal. You don't have to leave out women from there. So the text was changed. And this is symbolic, but very important. They were debated. And these principles are there. Conference agreed subject. So there was no link between colonialism and lack of human rights. So that period of World War II, a lot of the human rights concerns was about the Holocaust, for good reason. The killing of Jews, the Holocaust by the Germans. But the fact that there is colonialism is a form of denial of human rights, was not recognized. So the Bandung Conference in Indonesia did that, the first intercontinental conference of post-colonial countries in 1955. The colonialism, subjection of people to alien rule or domination and exploitation is a denial of fundamental human rights. First time that colonialism and human rights, or denial of human rights, have been linked. The broadening of human rights. Sovereign equality versus racial equality. So UN is based on sovereign equality. There's no racial equality norm, even preamble charter to this day. Now that's a gap. But racial equality was mentioned, equality of all races, not just equality of all states. So there are many other examples of addition and empowering of in the areas of human rights, democracy, self-determination, and also development and ecology. So to conclude then, just going back to my point, that this doesn't mean the world will become peaceful because of the ending of the Western-dominated order, but at least there will be a chance that we don't have to accept, we don't have to believe that only the West is capable of progressive ideas about world order. So that itself is my optimism. And it depends on politics and some diplomacy, but you cannot say that the West created everything and therefore the decline of the West is good. What I say about the decline of the West, the good thing is very important, is decline of Western dominance, not the end of Western dominance, not the end of the West. Although I would be very happy to see West disappear, the West disappear. Both are very modern, the West is definitely a racialized term, a racial term. Only we have them from the 19th century and 20th century onwards. But at least you have some sort of a optimism that we can get rid of the West versus the rest, and we can also think of new possibilities of world order developed out of this. So moving, the last two slides, by the way, I already showed you, so no need to. I wanted to show you this. This is why one of the reasons I wrote the book. In 2014, I started teaching the course on the civilizations and world. And I got this book published. I went to the book club. Chapter 1, Europe. Chapter 2, Europe. Chapter 3, Islam in a world in disorder. Then we come to India, little section. China, another section. And then it all ends up with the United States becoming acting for all of mankind. That's why I wanted to write this book. That's actually, set the record straight. Because the last time we checked, India and China came a lot before Europe. And they had very similar ideas. I'm not saying civilizations don't differ, but also there are similarities we should not ignore. And okay, I don't want to go into this policy, academic, but it has relevance for policy and academic. You can have more case studies. If you're a student, doing research, policymakers should avoid self-fulfilling prophecy, collapse, and also get rid of the West versus the rest. So this is the book. A lot of positive response, qualified, reluctant acceptance, but there's some also brutal takedowns. The Wall Street Journal. They wrote a critical review. They got somebody to write by an American Enterprise Institute guy. And when I sent a rejoinder, the editor told me, I can't publish it because it comes late. I was on paternity leave. I actually have the record on my website, my blog. But they just wanted to kill it. That's good, Getting killed by Wall Street Journal is actually kind of a badge of honor. It proves my point. All right. Sorry about taking a bit longer, but I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. We have a very full room, so I have no doubt that there will be many questions. I encourage students particularly to not be shy and start formulating your questions slowly. We can start right now. I can add the first one to the room, basically.
So how much time do we have?
We have still 4. So
Oh, that's
an hour.
okay.
Yeah.
So,
Lights are in background.
well, I think I can. This is something to think about. This is kind of the world order I look at, the Germany multipolar and multiplex. But we can talk about it. The one I didn't have.
So yeah, I see it. So I see some hands coming. I will take maybe a few questions together, and we can go around. So yeah, and can you please maybe identify yourself, name and region.
So I'm Joachim. I'm in
Now you have to speak a little bit so I can.
Hi, my name is Joachim. Can you hear me? Is it? Okay. And so my question was about, of course, thank you for the presentation, a very, very insightful presentation. I was wondering, what is your take on the rising tensions that we see, especially with dominant powers like the US versus rising powers like China, where we're seeing a lot of tension, where some countries or most countries in the world order wouldn't want to see conflict happening between those great powers, but those great powers are definitely in a tug of war, let's say, of influence that seems to be getting more and more dangerous.
Your question is, what do I think about this great power competition? Like China, United States, are you asking me how we can solve it? Or what do I think of?
Well, I would say, what do you think is the impact going to be on the future order that you're trying to present in terms of how we move to a multipolar and then a multiplex as you presented?
Do you want to take another question?
We can take a few if you want. There's one at the front here.
My name is Amitav. I'm a recent graduate of the Public and International Affairs program, the graduate program here. I've really been a fan of your work since I was an undergrad. So I really like how you, I think, put a reality check on what the world order, like what is happening actually in the world right now, instead of like the usual, like you showed in the Kissinger book, the usual spiel. My question is, I suppose it's in the same vein as the previous question. How do you envision that the United Nations would change and in the way that it works? Say, for example, how the Security Council works when such a multiplex system comes about.
Want one more, or
Yeah, I think one more. Yeah.
So Andrew at the back here.
This is a book of history, not what is happening today. I always end up passionate about.
Right, maybe like
We go back to like 3,000. You asked me a question about Russia, and for the last 5 years, I've been living thousands of years of the past. My mind is always full of those. But I'm happy to answer questions to the best of my ability. Yeah.
My question was going to be pretty presentist as well, but I'll try to reframe it a little bit. My name is Andrew Heffernan. I'm an adjunct professor here in the School of Political Studies. I've got a number of my students here. And one thing that I say to them, I've got a bunch of IR versions of courses, and this is the kind of thing that I'm thinking about very often. I think a lot of scholars like me have spent the past 20 years or so kind of critiquing the liberal international order as it was, and particularly as it relates to the global south. I very much buy your argument that moving forward, that there's real opportunity for if not better, perhaps more fair. I think that's very fair. I'm thinking a bit to Ray Dalio's book on changing world orders, and he kind of speaks to this broader argument you're making that looking at the past 3,000 years, there has been these rise and falls, but often these are pretty revolutionary, almost always pretty bloody. So I guess my question is kind of, to what degree do you think it is likely that it leads to either a positive or more fair outcome? I certainly think that it is possible,
Either
or more fair, because I certainly think that is possible. And again, as someone who's kind of been critiquing a lot of what's been going on internationally for the past 20 or 30 years, I also think that we are headed in a pretty dark direction, certainly for much of the West, but I also think maybe for the global South as well as much of the world, because of the global instability that we're seeing, and maybe that'll just be a short period of time before things get better or more fair. Sorry for the very long question.
Okay, let me quickly ask a question. I think I might save the great power question to the end because I'm not still sure I got it entirely right. But I will, although I personally talk to you. Remember, it's a great question. On the UN, I actually, yesterday morning, I woke up at 6 o'clock in the morning to even, you can actually Google it, exactly because the UN is, General Assembly started today, this year, 80th anniversary of the UN. So they also asked me the same question. This is CPS morning news, not CNN or BBC. So it's actually, traffic report, borders, and UN. So when you come to the driving today, be prepared for delays. And then Professor Acharya, what is going to happen to the UN? So I said, of course, Trump will be going there to make his big claim for the Nobel Prize, and Palestine issue, of course, is a kind of a very, is a maybe a game changer now, and then talk about China. So I did the usual thing. But the question about the future reform of the UN, that's a difficult one. But I did talk about giving more authority to the General Assembly and changing the Security Council veto system. Easier said than done. It's really been tried, especially expanding the Security Council. But if you don't do this, let's forget about the Security Council. You don't accept. The UN is a very large system, right? It's not one institution. There are a lot of parts of the UN which are very good, still do a good job. And I really think UNESCO does a great job. The US is withdrawing from it. I'm UNESCO chair. But just think about UNESCO's work in protecting heritage. I think WHO does a good job generally for all its faults. It's having benchmarked. There are very qualified people working there. The Children's Fund, the UNSCR, they're all, despite the limitations, peace operations. But maybe Security Council, I would be very happy if they get rid of the Security Council if they can't reform it. But it will be obsolete if it doesn't reform. So giving more authority to the General Assembly and at least more legitimacy to General Assembly, again, easier said than done, would be a good way to go. The UN was created 80 years ago when the world was very different. How can you not have countries? You won't have Britain and France, okay? But you don't have India and Germany. Not okay. And especially Japan, we're not members of NATO like Germany. But I think the whole veto system could be discarded. You can have double veto system. You have to have veto by twice on the same issue in slightly different formulas. Or there have been things like veto. You can have permanent members, but don't have veto power. So there are a lot of things talked about. That was kind of really the key. Otherwise, the Security Council is just a top job. And they have some enforcing ability, but they're not really doing what they're supposed to do. And the future, positive or whether the future may be positive or not. This is a question that I get asked a lot from my previous books as well, The End of American World Order. People think I think the future will have good. But let me tell you one very important thing. It depends on where are you looking at it from. So there is, I'm talking about world order, not specific countries. That the world order is declining, China is rising, and West is relatively, it's all relative, by the way. The United States is not declining in absolute terms. It's still the biggest superpower with all the indices of power. Military, economic, financial, technological, dominant probably will remain for a while. But whether that will lead to order or disorder depends on where you stand. So the opinion polls show very clearly that the pessimism is at its bleakest in the Western capitals. So in London, in Washington, in Berlin, maybe Ottawa, whereas if you look at places like Beijing, New Delhi, a lot more support for globalization, a lot more optimism because they come from a very low base. So therefore, anything that has happened is better for them. And you say that they benefited from the American-led liberal order. But the question I ask in my book, in the chapter, why did Singapore do so much better than Philippines? Both were allies of the United States. Philippines was a bigger ally of the US than Singapore. Because also, I mean, not condoning dictatorships or authoritarianism, but the agency of the local system matters. They use resources better than in the, and so you cannot say it's just because there was an external liberal order that everybody should benefit. Doesn't happen like that. So it all, I mean, East Asia did better than say Africa. I mean, economically speaking, not in terms of in other areas. So to say that only the liberal order provided the opportunity is not right, and therefore also depend your optimism and pessimism depends on where are you located, from what vantage point you're looking at it from. So for a vast majority of global South, what is happening today is much better than what I was there 100 years ago under colonial rule, and where there was very little freedom and a lot of. It's not like I'm making it up. I'm not a post-colonial scholar. It's all based on what I've read and studied, that there was huge number of atrocities, violations, but the whole idea of subjugation. I think the worst effect of colonialism was actually not violence or economic exploitation. It's the psychological that Franz Fanon talked about. You feel like mentally enslaved. You feel like you are inferior to these white people. And that is supposed to affect people like me because I grew up in India. I always used to think that, yeah, only the West can do good things. We cannot do that. That is actually the most pernicious effect of imperialism and colonialism. And if that sort of disappears and people become more aware of the opportunities, no matter what Trump can do or may not do, they actually feel better about it. There are, of course, atrocities, tragic situations and genocide. There is, of course, human rights violation, but those things, they said before, they will continue, and we should be concerned about it. We should be worried about nuclear war. We should be worried about climate catastrophe. But at the same time, if you think the world is falling apart, and then what's the point? It becomes passive, self-fulfilling prophecy. So this book tells you that you can actually do a lot, and even if the West doesn't want to do it or cannot do it, there are others who can do it. And now, India and China, between them, have more than 30% of the world's people. If they feel a bit more state, then that means something. Okay, so let's take the question. I'll come back to the great power question.
One here and then here. So let's go.
Yeah, hey, I'm Alden Lipton. I'm a student in the Department of... Oh, thank you.
Hey, I'm Alden Lipton. I'm a student in the Department of Political Science. This is a bit of a history question. I know you wanted those. But I was just wondering, you were talking about the goal of a multiplex system is to find, like, if not peace, at least stability, right? And I'm just wondering, is there any system throughout history, whether it be a hegemony, maybe a multipolar system,
like a multiplex?
Yeah, that was ever like that. And if there was, what can we learn from it? What were the consequences, if there's anything we can apply to this day and age?
Good question. Yeah.
Okay. This one, go towards the front. We have one question here.
My name is Kim McPhail. I'm a former student here. My question is actually very similar. I look at these two graphs and we hear all the time about a multipolar world order, and it can be conceptualized like that. I'm not sure what the one on the right means with the multiplex, so I'm really interested in the differences between it and how this one includes almost the whole planet, and I presume this one does too, but yet in our 21st century, the distance costs across various places in the world have shrunk to almost nothing. So if you go back 1,000 years, 2,000 years, you had clusters of places that could themselves at a lower scale be multipolar and multiplex. And what exactly is that multiplex in terms of structure?
Multiplex came from here, Ottawa. Really? The first multiplex in the world was actually first in Toronto, but that was the duplex. scenes. And the multiplex is actually,
I have
you
read-
can Google it.
I have lived
so-
in a duplex.
Choices, so you
Duplex.
can see more than, a choice of seeing one movie, several movies in the same,
Movie theaters.
meaning in the same day, rather than wait for that movie to go away and whatever you do for kids, wait for a month and the movie, the film is gone and then have. So it gives the audience a choice. That's one origin of the multiplex, but there are philosophical, mathematical origins of multiplex. Well, I'll talk about it. Shall we?
Quick question, and then we can take them.
Okay, I'm going to give you a longer historical question. I'm going to introduce myself so you know where I'm coming from first. My name is Scott Simon. I'm a professor here. My high school education was Afrocentric. At the university, I studied sinology and started embedding myself in a Chinese world. And then for the past 20 years, I've been studying the SEDC political philosophy. There are people of 10,000 people on Taiwan. So that's where I'm coming from. So I don't have that Western-centric viewpoint. That's what I'm getting to. So as I listen to you, I see that you're looking at the past 5,000 years of human history, but there's 100,000 years of human evolution. So that you're talking about the tiny bit at the end when the state came up. And you talk,
1,000 years.
yeah. So you're talking about how the state came up and it has to deal with the problem of anarchy. But in the shadow of all of these states, whether we're talking about the Incas or the Chinese or the Egyptians, there were these peoples that Pierre Classer once called the society against the state. And so there are all these people that are resisting the existence of the state, like the Algonquins right here. And so I was just kind of wondering where those would fit into your model. And then because you mentioned the South Pacific, Grotius, that's modern stuff there. The Austronesians settled the Pacific 3,500 to 4,000 years ago. So I was wondering where you put that in there. And then, so that's my question there is where do you put in those people without the state? Because it's not a question of the problem of anarchy for them. It's a question of the problem of the state.
All right, the historical multiplex, I think the closest, again, remember, history doesn't repeat itself. You cannot reproduce history, my view, but you can find similarities, patterns. So I think to answer that question, what was the closest approximation to the multiplex? I have to define what a multiplex means. So it's not just cinema. It's actually it's a world that has no one single dominant power, like a hegemon, which is still connected. So interdependence, connectivity doesn't disappear, and that's not just trade, but also finance, production networks, but also common ecological challenges. Creates, like there are two types of interdependence. One is the economic transactional interdependence, and one is existential interdependence. But what Trump can do, decouple with China, and break the idea of existential interdependence. That climate does that to you. We are interdependent, whether you like it or not. And so that kind of interdependence, not the trade interdependence that Cohen and I talked about. And then you have regional variations, regional structures, regionalisms, regional modes of governance have become very important in a multiplex world. So instead of everything being subsumed under globalization, global, you have local and regional playing a more important role. But there are diversity of ideas, no end of history, but varieties of ideologies and ideas. And now you can have democracy, authoritarianism, capitalism, humanitarianism, extremism. There's no one idea prevails over others. So this may sound very chaotic, but that's the world reality. So multiplex is complexity. So we have to accept the fact that there's no single patterns, neat, bipolar, multipolar. That's why the picture is, they're like billiard balls, right? Or it is more, they sometimes link, sometimes they don't link. Hegemon is also very simple. Multiplex is messy, complex. And it has to be managed as such. There's different layers. You have rising powers, great powers, non-state actors play a very important role. Regions become important theaters or sites of conflict and collaboration. So I wanted to deliberately make it look very messy. And but as you know, if you know chaos theory, which is also complexity theory, there is always a pattern to it. There's always some sort of a eventuality. That may be good or bad, but you can actually have both go in both ways. So I call it multiplex because it's not multipolar. Multipolarity is a very it's a term that we had before World War II. A bunch of great powers, almost all of them Western, the ideal type that we use historical imagination of multipolarity. And it's all about power defined as military and economic mainly. The role of ideas and norms don't play much role in this. And we hark back to the 19th century experience, which the multipolarity is bad because of what happened. So we are prisoners of that idea of multipolarity. You need a new vocabulary to get out of this. It doesn't capture the role of, okay, what is in it for Poland in multipolarity? Being subjected by one empire or another. So small states, medium powers, Canada in multipolarity. The Australians love to talk about multipolarity, and I said you will be the most marginalized country in the Pacific if you talk about it, because you don't have any agency. Multipolarity is a great power club. You're under great power tutelage, basically. So both normatively, but also descriptively, we are not in that world. So it's a very fashionable default line of policymakers. So, okay, we had a bipolarity, unipolar moment, and next was multipolarity. Emerging powers love to talk about it. Friends love to talk about it. Well, multipolarity means they have a role. And now the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians, all because it places them ahead of the totem pole of others, even though they're not great powers. Some of them not yet. So this becomes like a legitimization strategy in great power discourse. Countries which are not great powers should not be talking about multipolarity. They're kind of shooting themselves in the foot. So I kind of tell them, don't use that term because every term has a baggage. And you cannot just apply what is basically a 19th, early 20th century term in the context of a 21st century. Multiplex, I would think the historical Indian Ocean in 16th century, the Portuguese came to Malacca 1511, Goa 20 years earlier. But I think it's only after they came to Malacca that the system ceased to exist, that became more fragmented, divided, maybe multipolar, imperial multipolarity. Before that, it was a no great power domination, plenty of interdependence, trade and cultural, commercial, but cultural, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, all trading, technology. So it was interdependent, it was decentralized, and a lot of regional centers. And it was relative, I'm not saying it was peaceful, but it was peaceful in the sense that the trade was not violent. Trade was not interfered with. Trade and geopolitics did not really mix in the way we see later. The American and the British idea of free trade was basically empire. I mean, the United States actually even fought against the British to open door policy was basically displaced the British with the American capital and American trade. The British, in the name of free trade, colonized a lot of parts of the world. But that did not happen in the Indian Ocean. The trade was not the region for conquest. There was conquest, there was violence, but people left, especially the maritime trade alone. And it's pretty hard to find. I mean, there are examples of economic motivations for empire, but it was not the same way. There was other motivations, but the empire also left the sea alone. Sea was held in common. To the extent that one can think of, it was held in common. And that to me is a good example of if you ask me, I don't want to go back to that era, I'm not saying, but at least there was an ideal time. There was a kind of a situation which comes close to being a multiplex world. All right, and then Australasian. I actually went to New Zealand and see some Polynesian culture there. I was living in Taiwan for the year, went to many places to see their Australasian, and Indonesia, of course, Australasia. I think they don't get a lot of recognition, and including my book. I do have some discussion, but if I want to expand to a second edition of this book, I will really pay attention to that, because a lot of these ideas they're very similar. We see them as basically victims. I mean, I talk in my book about how disease wiped out the Polynesians, I mean, all the Micronesian and Austronesians, and how, but I also talk about their state system, their cultural symbolism, but nothing that I would like to talk, nothing comparable to other civilizations. I think they were a distinctive world order. And even though, like all world order, there are variations, but so much trade. I was amazed when I started looking at it, that so much interaction, maybe not trans-Pacific, but maybe there was, but certainly intra-Pacific. And the Pacific has not got recognition, including, I would say, in my book. So how did they fit in? Well, in many ways, what used to happen to Africa, I say, interrupted. Africa gets no agency, no recognition. Samuel Huntington said, Africa, possibly a civilization, possibly. He didn't. Why? Because in logic, most scholars don't recognize, scholars of civilization don't recognize Africa. So why should I? But who are these scholars? Hegel said Africa doesn't belong to history. So basically he said Africa is just out of history, not part of history. And Africa was always seen as the outlier, even though Africa played fundamental, and you can read the chapter of the book, both, well, human beings came from Africa. That is some part of the agency, right? So it has to be part of history. But also in globalization, the role of tragic but consequential transatlantic slave trade in basically creating the capitalist economy. Without the African labor combined with the resources from the Americas, we would have transition from, say, the agricultural economy of the medieval times to plantation economy. That plantation economy laid the foundation of capitalism and especially the rise of the United States. In 1860, more than 50% of the GDP of the United States was generated by slave labor. Now, Trump is going to abolish that history now. He has got somebody to, this is in the Museum of African American History, and I take my students for field visits there, and it's actually cited in the book. I quote from that. Now he's going to erase that history because he doesn't like, especially he's very much against that particular museum. Because it sort of graphically puts that there. So again, South Pacific is a bit like Africa, but much more so, in South Pacific, when the Europeans went there, they also had gradations. So the Polynesians and the Tahitians are beautiful people, nice people. So they are the Rousseau's ideal type. Okay, the state of nature, the noble savage. The Australian Aborigines, the worst human beings in the world. You will look at some of the books of that period. They also graded. Polynesians had kingdoms. They looked good, little fair skin, and so they graded even the South Pacific community. Although I'm not saying the Aborigines is the same as Polynesians, the differences. But the thing is, for that region as a whole, was also graded racially. It was very much part of the racial gradation of our people. So I think all these stories can be brought in. It's not, you don't have to be an expert in South Pacific. One of the things this book tries to do is to bring out these little stories and fit them into the narrative of global order. But I haven't done it as much as I should have.
We have time, not very much time, so I will take a last
minutes.
round,
Yeah.
5 minutes, but please be brief and we'll conclude after that.
You can make a comment, don't ask me a question. That's really a participation.
Comment.
Like in class we do.
So
Yeah.
you can go here and then please introduce yourself. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today. Command of 5,000 years of history is quite a scholarly achievement. Congratulations on that. Very interesting. When I did my high school back in East Africa, and in East Africa.
East Africa.
Okay, Tanzania.
I did a lot of work on Kenya.
Yeah, so I did my high school there, and I did my HSC, you know, the British system of A levels and O levels. During the A levels, one of the books that we had to read in history was Africa and the Victorians. It's a book by Robinson and Gallagher. One sentence still remains with me of that book. The book, they state in the book, empires come and empires go, but imperialism is forever resurrected.
Well, that's a good one. Thanks for bringing that. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Jacqueline. I'm a master's student of public and international affairs here. My question is about kind of the fundamental assumptions in our view of IR. So in IR, Western IR 101, we will learn that nation states are motivated by self-interest. And when we see states cooperating, it's actually because the collective interest is in their self-interest. And what I'm hearing from some non-Western perspectives is that on IR is that actually some of these are more founded on a true commitment to the collective interest of even other states. And so I look forward to reading the book, but if you would highlight for us if you found in your research any models of order that are truly showing this logic of more of the collective interest rather than operating on self-interest, and what conditions you think favor that logic of ordering.
Question.
Hello, my name is Abdel. I'm a student, master in public and international affairs. I have just a small comment and regarding the Fukuyama statement of the end of history. I think it's related to this at the world liberal order trigger of the communism and other ideologies. But I think it's reminds me the idea that maybe in the history, the orders comes one after the other. We can't stop the march of the history, and men tend to be impressed and intimidated by the reality. When there's an order and is here, and it's not always to last always, but we project that this the only word that will prevail for a long time, and maybe now we are seeing the start, maybe the beginning of the American order is declining, and it opens a new opportunity maybe to multipolar world and other new powers to rise in the international scene.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, answer, but let me just try to, I can't remember questions very well. I would like to say IR question. I mean, this is not a IR book, and if you want to be an IR scholar, probably shouldn't read this book. I almost felt like picking up, and I am an IR scholar, and I said, everything I read, all of I read are so long. But on the other hand, you can use this book to enrich IR, redefine IR. It all depends on you. This was written for my first year. A lot of this book was lectures and seminars, like interactive discussions with my first year students for 10 years. And in fact, when I'm launching the book next week in my university, they are the MCs and many of the students are coming in because they come out of school, high school, going into college. And I started by asking, there's a quiz I ask. I mean, what is China's biggest invention? Or who is the Islamic philosophy? Do you know that most of the stars in the night sky are actually named by Arabs? I mean, these are kind of questions that force that. They had no idea. The fact that there was a code of Manu, so it's actually that sort of shock and awe actually how to teach this class. And I started writing this up. And then I thought I'll write a broader book because the text we had, like Kissinger, did not really, I still use Kissinger, but actually to show what we actually have and what we should be having. But I think in that sense, hopefully this will influence teaching and research and thinking about IR in a way that will be very different from what we have today. So I'm not saying don't read the book, but read it in a way that you can actually make use of. It's usable knowledge when in terms of, in the sense of broadening a horizon. If you're actually at a PhD level, master's level, yeah, more case studies. I've just written an article looking at why multipolarity in the past is actually not necessarily unstable, because we only get our idea of multipolarity from Europe, where it was violent, except for the brief concept of war period. But we have an Amarna period, 15th century BC, where 5 great powers of the Middle East actually kept peace for 200 years, not 50 years, like concept of Europe. Egypt had the Babylon, Assyria, and Mitanni. So that narrative is one of my chapters. So you can actually expand IR's horizon, or maybe make it rethink its fundamental assumptions. If you think about human rights, well, you can, there's no such thing as human rights in the contemporary sense until the 20th century. But there are all these ideas about protecting people, and that maybe the French Revolution, the American maybe Bill of Rights, and Magna Carta, the different points of evolution. But I think we should also look at property rights. Or King Ashoka's laws. One great thing about King Ashoka's edict is that you could actually, this was like a law on demand. Because a lot of people are illiterate at those times. So if you're being taken to prison, you can actually stop those stone pillars in towns. So can you read this to me? What are my rights? The king says, protect no arbitrary punishment or harsh treatment. So you actually were used as such. And the instructions, I mean, in some ways, the government creates the law. I mean, it can't have law unless it is somewhat sanctioned and legislated and coded. This was a codification of the law, except it was not done by us. Well, India did have assemblies like Sabha and Samiti. They're not parliaments in the sense, but they did have wider representation, as in a old-fashioned Roman Republic, not a true democracy. But they did have same kind of wider representation. Indian republics actually had more representation of kings and clans, but nonetheless, they were not just the ruler, king or the queen, calling all the shots. And this sort of Buddha was born in a republic. Okay, so that's why Buddhism actually is the most secular and democratic religion of the ancient world. Because the founder, Gautama Buddha, was an anti-monarchist, anti-Brahmin, anti-caste. And he was thinking was to reform and change. And the Republican idea of a Buddha, King Ashoka became a Buddhist. And he started creating these rules that would be more, if you shouldn't say human rights, but at least human security. Okay. So that's basically what this book can do. It can enhance, expand the horizons of IR. It can challenge conventional thinking in IR. And there will be, of course, some pushback and some resistance to this. It can happen. But I think it's a great thing to engage with. And I'm very happy to be engaged as such. And, the book has been reviewed in many other places. And people have been fair. They've said, what is valuable, what they disagree with, not like throw the book to the fire. But that's what you said, dear. You can challenge, and I'm very happy. I mean, this idea that Michael will tell us, I mean, I did not know the Greek idea of liberty. They were always talking of liberty at the drop of every hat. But then you actually read those, and the funeral speech of, and then, of course, the whole Greek-Persian War. There's so much injustice towards Persians. I mean, do you know that many Greeks prefer to work under Persians than under Athens? Because the Athenians are brutal, and Persians gave them space. They can be brutal too, but they were too big. They left them alone. So Themistocles actually worked for King Artaxerxes, because he was ostracized from Greece. So where did he go? He goes to Persia and he gets asylum, becomes a governor. The guy who owned Marathon and Salamis. The fact is that the Persians actually were more liberal, more open-minded than the Greeks, because the Greeks talk about liberty, but liberty, they fought all the time. Liberty of Athens against Sparta, Sparta against Corinth, and then all Greeks against Persia. But when the Persian threat was minimized or Persians didn't care about the Greeks. They didn't care about Persia more than Persians care about the Greeks. But the whole narrative of Western history is built around ancient Greece and Rome. I mean, again, I just give them full credit. But when yesterday at Charlie Kirk's funeral, or the day before yesterday, the White House advisors invoked, we are the Greeks, we are the Romans in the United States. I just thought that, does he actually know, has he ever read the history of other civilizations? And I'm not, I just said, I'm a big fan of Greek civilization, but we oversell it and undersell the achievements of Persia and other civilizations, which actually is really sad. We have made movies caricaturing Persians. We talk of, look, everybody reads in IR, the $1 million, right? But the professors, classic professors have said how brutal the Persians were. They killed and enslaved. But here is Athenians doing this to the fellow Greeks, killing all that. I think I have heard Michael Williams talk about $1 million that Paul Evans brought into one of the classes, right? So we used to read that. And so I still read that. I quote that in my
I don't want to.
completely, the whole population was annihilated. So why would you then think they're any better than anybody else? Anyway, so that's what it will do to IR. It'll challenge the long-standing assumptions, give them a new idea that get you to the best.
You have been very generous with your time, even more. But this event comes to an end. Please join me in thanking your